Hello everybody, my name is Vera Raivola and I'm a junior researcher and a PhD student at the University of Eastern Finland and a researcher at the Finnish Red Cross Blood Service. I'm really honored and happy to be invited to give this talk at the Donor Research Network Week of Talks, and I'm going to talk to you about the topic managing the unknowns, blood donation for biobanking. In this talk, I will make two arguments. First, that biobank donation introduces new unknowns and uncertainties to blood donation, and second, that managing these unknowns and uncertainties needs to be a joint effort for blood donors and the blood service. My talk is divided into the following three topics. I start by presenting my PhD project, then I discuss some of the observations from the discussions with donors that we had, and then I end by opening the discussion about the implications of these results. I would like to start by introducing the other people whose contribution has been essential to this PhD project. As you can see, my supervisors here represent a really multidisciplinary group of experts. And of course, I'm really indebted to voluntary study participants who have shared their times and ideas with me, as well as the blood service professionals whose expert knowledge has helped me to gain access to the field and understand what's actually happening in that field. And then I would like to thank also my STS Helsinki group colleagues who have given me support in my social science research. So why is biobanking a topic of interest in blood donor studies? In November 2017, the Finnish Red Cross Blood Service Biobank started recruiting blood donors. It has since successfully reached its recruitment target of 50,000 biobank consents from blood donors. The Blood Service Biobank is now one of 10 research biobanks in Finland, established after the biobank law came into force in 2012. According to this law, a biobank donation is based on informed consent, which can be later withdrawn, and it also lists rights for the donor to learn about what research has used her donations and to receive research findings of health relevance. So what is a biobank? Here is a description from the Finnish Biobank's joint site. A biobank collects donor-related information and biological samples to be used for a variety of future research needs. Here you can see an ad from the recent FinDonor study. It was a large cohort study on donor health conducted before the Blood Service Biobank launched. It has not been uncommon for the Blood Service to recruit research subjects amongst the blood donors or supply donated material for biomedical research. But biobanking was something new. So the Blood Service was very interested to learn about how donors viewed this new opportunity and what they expected from it. To learn about blood donors' views, I first conducted 61 interviews at 7 different blood collection centers around southern Finland. Then later, me and Dr. Snell organized 10 focus group discussions with both groups of blood donors and non-donors. Such qualitative, more explorative study approach was chosen because the blood donor biobank was still a new phenomenon. You can find more detailed descriptions of the data collection from our publications. The interviews and focus group discussions covered questions related to these three contexts for blood donation, starting from the most familiar to the donors, asking about their motives, knowledge, preferences, and expectations related to blood donation for use of patients, then scientific research, and for biobanking. Before discussing the results, a few words about my sociological approach on donation that I have adopted from scholars like Richard Titmuss, Kieran Healy, Helen Busby, and many others who have made important contributions to this field. From the sociological viewpoint, donating as a process of material and symbolic exchange creates social relationships between those who give and those who receive. What is often being studied is how this exchange is organized in different institutional contexts by different norms, laws, roles, organizational practices, and other kinds of structures. It's also studied how this institutional organization influences donor experience and shapes shared meanings about blood donation, which is the focus of my study. I will now present some of my observations about the ways in which the blood donors in this study discussed the meaning of blood donation, especially in reference to what they felt to be known and what yet unknown when reviewing the different institutional contexts for giving donations. Before moving to the analysis, I wish to point out two relevant findings. All except two of the interviewees and all of the focus group members said that they would likely give a consent and could donate blood also for the blood service biobank. Yet at the same time, by their own account, most of them did not know much about biobanks, what they are or what they do. During the interviews and focus groups, the study participants were giving a short description of biobanking. Following the structuring of the interviews and focus groups, my data analysis on the knowns and unknowns is organized by donation context. In this visualization of the data analysis, the line marks study participants' present experience of donating blood from being asked to think about their future also as biobank donors. When analyzing what was known to be donated, all the study participants knew that donors' blood was being collected by the blood service to be given to transfusion patients as medical treatments, and many also knew donated blood to be tested and fractioned into components. Moving on to discuss about the donation of blood samples and other donor information that was collected by the biobank as research material, what was now being donated was known to be donors' data. For what kind of research and development purposes this data would be used was still unknown to donors, and something that many considered beyond their expertise to review. Yet this donated biobank data was expected and hoped for to help create new treatments, but it was unknown what they would be, and it seemed uncertain if and how they would be realized in practice. Looking at who was known to be the recipient, in case of donated blood, this was known to be a Finnish hospital patient. For some, it had also been a friend or a relative, and it was acknowledged that one day this patient could be the donor herself. A donation for the blood service biobank would be to help scientific researchers to conduct important studies. Who those researchers were and what kind of research they did was unknown to the biobank donor. Ultimately, the researchers using biobank data were expected to create new knowledge that could be used to improve the health of future generations. Yet research processes were understood to be long and uncertain, and there was always a risk that new discoveries were used in ways that harm others or benefited only the wealthy few. For those discussing the potential future recipients, this future was known to be full of uncertainties. So the blood service biobank was expected to be cautious about who it allowed to use donor data and for what purposes. What was known at the present about biobanking, and what kinds of outcomes should a biobank donor know to expect? Based on what they had learned so far, study participants assumed voluntary blood donation to stay more or less the same, despite extending to biobanking. However, as one interviewee described, for her, the idea of her blood sample sitting on a shelf in some freezer, instead of being used by a trauma patient, did not seem as important or motivating. What was yet to be shown, but expected from the blood service biobank, was high-quality data management, including protecting donors' data privacy. Some study participants did also express ideas of what kinds of results biobank research could or should deliver, and there was interest to learn about the research results, especially if they might be of personal health benefit. The final outcomes of biobank research and product development were expected to be seen in public health and healthcare services in the future. As donors, the participants were hopeful but aware of potential social and ethical risks of banking large amounts of potentially valuable personal data. The main concerns related to commercialization of donor data, not because these donors were unaware, for example, of the role of big pharma in drug development, but because private profit interests were recognized, often contradicting the values of voluntary donation in giving access to care for the patients most in need. Based on my data, I suggest that what it means to be a voluntary blood donor is a matter of institutionally embedded donor experience. I would also guess that knowing about this donor experience is core expertise for many of today's listeners. At the time of my data collection, thinking of what it means to be a biobank donor was still only hypothetical. Now more than 50,000 blood donors are also donors for the Blood Service Biobank, so experiences are starting to form. How much of what it means to be a biobank donor is for the donors to figure out and to manage, and how much is this a process of learning together? As this Blood Service Biobank webpage points out, biobanking is about new dimensions and extending the social and personal effects of blood donors' help to the unknown future. Things taken for granted in voluntary blood donation will change when extended to biobank donation. What used to be known becomes much more complex and uncertain. It should be clearly acknowledged that many of the blood donors' unknowns are equally unknowns and uncertainties for Blood Service Biobank and research experts. Yet many of these things becoming known is in the scope of their professional influence, while beyond the control of voluntary blood donors, for whom these are matters of expectations, hopes, and trust. I would like to end with a few arguments about possible implications on donor biobank partnerships, and leave you with a few questions on how these new relations should be managed. So I argue that giving a biobank consent or a biobank donation does not solve the problem of not knowing donation outcomes, but different tools are required to manage these uncertainties. So what could they be? I also think that many donors might give a biobank consent for loyalty towards the blood service, and maybe then forget it afterwards. So if something happens, how to avoid bad surprises? Donors also expected their values and the public interest to be represented in the Blood Service Biobank's decision making. How these expectations are realized in biobank governance. There might be risks on relying too much on slogans and promises when educating donors about biobanking that the donors themselves perceive to be a complex, risky, and uncertain project associated with quite vague hopes for a better future. So how to best communicate the value of biobank donations for donors? The donors that I talked with were careful to emphasize that they were not against science, but had valid reasons to be cautious about biobank donation and critical of the current R&D and healthcare systems biobanks and blood banks are part of. So how are these concerns taken into account? That was my talk today. Thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to hear your questions and comments and to continue the discussion. Here are also a few references if you're interested to learn more about the Blood Service Biobank. Please go and check the webpage and also the list of our publications so far. Thank you so much.